Hello, good morning and welcome here at this live online debate session about a grip on hazardous substances, a EU perspective. My name is Gerrit Heikoop and I have the honor to host you this morning in this very interactive and lively session that we're going to participate in for the next 2 hours or so. But I'm glad I don't have to do that by myself. I'm joined by Co Verdaas. Co, good morning.
Good morning.
You're officially my co-host. You are a member of the Council for the Environment and the Infrastructure, those who wrote and presented this report today that we discuss. And you're also the chair of the committee within the Council who was preparing this report. Before we get to all of that, the context and why we're here this morning, let's start with you and me as a consumer. Because this morning we talk about hazardous substances, something quite abstract, probably not for the people who are joining here this morning, but for many consumers, our families, this is something far away, because we are used to talk about products.
Yeah.
Well, I've asked you to bring a product here to the studio this morning that visualizes where substances can be where we don't expect it. What did you bring?
I did bring a can of sardines.
All right.
And to be honest, I have a background as an urban planner. So for me, chemistry is a new field of expertise, so to say. And I had to acknowledge during this trajectory that I wasn't aware of any substances in products like this.
Everyday household items are full of hazardous substances.
And for example, in this tin of sardines, there is a substance, and the name is, I have written it down, bisphenol. Mm-hmm. And that's a softener for plastics, so you can make the curvings in the coating. And this is absolutely safe to eat this fish, no problem. But all these products we use in everyday life, they have bisphenol and other substances, and altogether, we don't know where we are getting at. So
exactly, and that is one of the key messages in this report. This is the Dutch version. The English version is also available on the website right now. A grip on hazardous substances. And one of the key things it's addressing, it's about accumulation. Yeah. So in itself, this tin is safe and it's below all the limits that are stated for this substance. But if we start to add all these substances together, we don't know where we're at.
Yeah, that's correct, Gerrit. We did design our policies on individual substances, but altogether, the new combinations in the environment and the accumulation in the environment. So we need a more comprehensive approach, so to say. That's the main message of the report.
Yeah. Well, let's for our international audience also, let's understand where we are. You are joining us from all over Europe. We saw in the registrations. Welcome. Good morning. Glad you're with us this Monday morning. We are in a building that's here between us also in a little mock-up. It's the B30, Bezuidenhoutseweg 30. It's a very old monumental building. Yeah. Used to be the Ministry of Economic Affairs. Yeah. And currently, it's the home of 5 different organizations who all work in this field of what we call the triple helix, right? The knowledge institutions, society, and policymakers. And it's also the home of the Council for the Environment and Infrastructure. For those viewers who are not familiar with this institute, how do you explain what this council is?
Yeah, it's an independent advisory board for the Dutch government and the parliament. Yeah. And we provide the government with solicited and unsolicited advices, reports on every topic that is connected with the environment, with infrastructure, urban planning, but also the risk of the topic we are dealing with today.
Exactly. And on March 11th, over 2 months ago, this report was presented to the Dutch Ministry of Environment and Housing, Stientje van Veldhoven. But it was very clear immediately that this needs a broader scope than just the Netherlands. Why is that?
Yeah, we have an international open economy, and these kind of issues with products are moved all over the world, industries that are doing their job all over the world. You need an international standard, and that starts, of course, on EU level, to create a level playing field. That's the only way to deal with those issues. Just making policies on your own as a country, that can make sense, of course, but when every country makes his own policies, designs his own policies, that's not a fruitful perspectives. So
Exactly.
we need to coordinate it.
And I learned from you, because one of your roles is also you're chairman of a Dutch water board.
Yeah.
We are in the river delta of Europe, so also specifically in our area in the Netherlands, this is of relevance because every substance in the waterways of Europe ends up here in the Netherlands.
When it rains in Germany and France, and whatever comes in the water, it's also coming to the Netherlands. So that is also a plea for international approach.
Exactly. Now, before I explain to you what you can expect this morning, let's first, now that we understand why we are here and where we are, we would like to better understand who you are and with what perspective you are joining this morning. And if this is your first online event, let me explain how it works. You're watching the live stream right now, and on the right side of your screen, about over here, there's our interactivity box. You can do two things there during the broadcast. You can type in your questions or comments or reflections, and we will take your questions and present them to our panel that we have here this morning. Or if you don't have any questions yourself, you can use the thumbs up to promote questions or comments from others. And we will then sort those questions on those with the most thumbs up and prioritize those questions. And a third option is we can send questions to you. And we just did that. We asked you 3 questions about who we have in the room this morning. First of all, we'd love to know what your professional organization is. Are you with a company? Are you in government, either local, national, or international? Are you with a knowledge institute? Are you with an NGO? Or are you with other? Second question is, what drives you to participate in this session this morning? And a third question is about your perspective. Do you have mainly a Netherlands-Dutch perspective, or do you work in an EU perspective? And please fill out those 3 questions, and don't forget to hit submit at the bottom of this field, and then the questions come in. And if I can get the results on the screen, I would love to see what type of audience we have with us this morning. We see the poll is filled out by already 50 people. And the answer to the first question, if I could get the results on the screen, that would be that we see, let me wait up till the results turn up. If my colleagues can please hit the first question. We see that, we'll wait for that while more of you fill that out. If you haven't done so, please fill out why you want to participate and what your perspective is. If we see that over 60 people are joining us already, let me use this time also to explain to you that if you are on social media, whether that is Twitter or whether that is LinkedIn, we also have a hashtag this morning where we want to broaden the reach of this online event. Please use the hashtags hazardous substances so everybody knows immediately what we're talking about, or more specifically for this event, hashtag Rli-online, and RLI is the abbreviation for the Dutch Council of Environment and Infrastructure. It seems that we have some technical problems to get the results on the screen. So for now, I'll get back to you later and tell you what the results of the polls are. Thank you for submitting. We'll use those later in the broadcast. Because what can you expect here this morning? We have a very dense program for you that works into 3 steps. We have 2 discussion rounds where we will talk. First of all, we have asked 2 experts to give a first response, an introduction, a reflection on this report. In the first round, we talk about the sense of urgency of this topic and the analysis that is provided in the report. And then we have something that we call the blue room. We have different stakeholders with different perspectives who we asked to respond to what we've seen, and we're trying to create a discussion. And in that discussion, you can participate as well by sending in your questions and comments. Then we will have a short break. We have a second round of discussion where we focus much more on who's to take action. How do we translate the insights and the findings from this report into actual policy or actions taken by industry or action taken by consumers? And who's the first to move? Always difficult question. Again, this is an interactive bit with both 2 introductory presentations, responses from our blue room, and questions from you as an audience. Then in a third step, we are very honored to have with us here this morning Diederik Samsom, who is the head of the cabinet of the EU Commissioner Timmermans, who is responsible for lining up the Green Deal. And we will then ask him how this report and our discussion and debate here this morning fits in with their objectives and their aims in preparing that Green Deal and how we can align those things even further. So we're very much looking forward to that. And then in the end, again, a very honorable person to join us this morning, and I already noticed he's already with us this morning, Jan-Jaap de Graaf. He's the chair of the Council for the Environment and Infrastructure. Jan-Jaap, good morning. Jan-Jaap, I'm very happy that you're with us this morning. At the end of this very long online debate, you'll be making notes throughout, and you'll be enlightening us with the wrap-up conclusions of how we need to move forward at the end. Thanks for being with us, Jan-Jaap.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, we start to move to the content of our program. We've prepared a longer video, about 11 minutes, where we go through all the recommendations and the first reflections from stakeholders. We're not going to run that video right now. We made a short summary, 4-minute video, where we see you talk again about the key message of this report, some key recommendations, and some first reflections from stakeholders who've been involved in this research. For all our international viewers, don't be surprised. The sound of the video is in Dutch, but there's English subtitles on the video, so you pay attention and you can follow along. We'll see you back for the first round after this video.
Het adviesgreep op gevaarlijke stoffen is uitgebracht omdat we steeds meer onbekende stoffen in onze omgeving tegenkomen. Dat leidt ook tot incidenten waarbij mensen zich zorgen maken. Hey, wat gebeurt er op mijn grasveld, in mijn riviertje? En als raad hebben wij gezegd, dat is aanleiding om daar eens goed in te duiken. Ook omdat uit heel veel onderzoek bleek dat we op individuele stoffen de toxiciteit verminderen, maar in het geheel het eigenlijk achteruit holt. Dus er is iets aan de hand.
De kwaliteit van de bronnen voor de productie van drinkwater staat onder druk. De bronnen worden onder meer bedreigd door gewasbeschermingsmiddelen, medicijnresten, andere zeer zorgwekkende stoffen, industriële lozingen, microplastics. En de RLI onderkent deze bedreigingen en stelt dat bij de overheid kennis en capaciteit om de stoffen te beoordelen beperkt zijn.
Als gemeentebestuurders weten we natuurlijk als geen ander dat onze inwoners hechten aan een veilige en gezonde leefomgeving. En ze gaan er eigenlijk ook vanuit dat wij toezicht houden op die veilige en gezonde leefomgeving. Nou heeft dat vertrouwen de laatste tijd wel een beetje wat deuken opgelopen. En daarom ben ik ook zo blij met het rapport van de Raad voor de Leefomgeving. Waarin ze 10 aanbevelingen doen om meer grip te krijgen op gevaarlijke stoffen.
In het rapport komen de belangrijkste knelpunten aan bod. De noodzaak om te komen tot integrale risicobeoordeling en niet compartiment voor compartiment. De noodzaak om zeer zorgwekkende stoffen in de hele productieketen in oogschouw te nemen. En de noodzaak om niet stof voor stof naar de impact te kijken, maar naar de totale impact en dus ook aandacht te hebben voor cumulatieve effecten.
De belangrijkste conclusie uit het advies is dat we een beleid hebben wat zeg maar, op incidentele stoffen, individuele stoffen zich richt met normstellingen, maar dat we daarmee te weinig oog hebben voor het stapelen van stoffen, want die worden soms niet of heel langzaam afgebroken. Die gaan vaak ook nieuwe verbindingen aan. Ja, en daarmee treden er effecten op waar we met het huidige beleid te weinig zicht op hebben. En dat moet echt anders. De eerste maatregel, en die is ook randvoorwaardelijk om het beter te gaan doen, is transparantie. We moeten weten welke stoffen in welke producten gaan en dat hebben we nu niet op orde. Een heel belangrijke aanbeveling is dat je in de hele keten je maatregelen moet nemen. Dus niet alleen met wettelijke normen en producenten daarop aanspreken met de vergunningverlening. Maar we willen ook naar een circulaire economie toe in 2050. En dat betekent dat afval ook weer grondstof wordt. En dat dus stoffen die bijvoorbeeld in gebruik in een tuin zeg maar, ja, prima toepasbaar zijn, maar in één keer in een pizzadoos terugkomen en er ligt aan jouw eten op. Nou, wil je dus de belofte van de circulaire economie waarmaken, zul je dus in die hele keten moeten volgen welke stoffen op welk moment in de keten zitten. Want anders dan komt die belofte van de circulaire economie zwaar onder druk te staan. En dat is een eufemisme, die gaan we dan niet realiseren. Als we alle bal op de overheid richten, komt het niet goed. Ook consumenten hebben verantwoordelijkheid. Maar die moeten die dan ook kunnen nemen. Dus de meeste mensen zijn totaal niet bewust, ik zelf ook niet, van wat er in welk product zit. Dus je moet daarbij helpen. Labeling zou kunnen helpen. En de producenten zelf, die hebben ook aangegeven, wij willen wel innoveren. Maar dan helpt het ook als er een beloning op innovatie komt te staan. En het huidige stelsel beloont innovaties niet. Dus het is in de hele keten, consumenten, producenten en wet en regelgeving waar dingen moeten veranderen.
All right, welcome back here in our little studio. We've moved from our comfy chairs to the desco, where we can also, in a minute, welcome our international panelists. They're from all over Europe, from Sweden, from Denmark, from Germany, from Belgium. Everybody is tuning in. And by now, we've managed to bring you the results of the opening poll. So let's quickly see who we have in the room here. First of all, our audience is a nice mix, where we see about 46% who is joining us from a government organization, policymakers, on different levels, I suppose. We have about 24% of the 60 people currently submitted to the poll who are with us from a knowledge institute. We have about 12% from industry, 6% from NGO, and some others.
Okay.
And what I find interesting, our little word cloud on what makes people want to participate code this morning, professional interest. People are curious. They want to know on the mixture of impacts. They want to know how this relates to their work. They are worried about the current Dutch policy, I read. They are very interested in the discussion, so thank you for sharing that as well. And then the last one, and I really like the outcome of that one, we've asked you, are you mainly in your work looking at a Dutch national perspective or at the EU perspective? And here we see a nice 50-50 blend. So this is exactly the aim of this online session here this morning. We want to bring this Dutch national report into a European context and see if we can broaden the message that has been presented. So thank you for participating and thank you for joining here this morning.
Nice overview.
That's a nice overview, eh? Yes. So let's start with our first round of discussion. This is all about the first reflections and the observations that are presented in the report. The report consists of 10 very specific recommendations at different moments in the chain, and if you're interested to read more about the report, click on the links on the right side of your screen where you can download the report also in English and in Dutch. If you click on the link, you can find a very nice infographic where the 10 recommendations are listed very clearly. How this will work, we will hear two short introductions, short presentations from two experts, and then we go into interactive debate. So if anywhere during the presentations you have a question, or maybe you already have a questions, make sure you have the opportunity and send them in. Let's introduce our first panelist. Go. We are joined from Germany by Mr. Werner Brack, who was the project coordinator of the EU Solutions Research Program, a very important cornerstone for this report for the Council as well, because it looked at the accumulation of hazardous substances in our waterways. Yeah. Werner, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your willingness to participate in this online debate and present us your first reflections on the report. We're very curious to learn from you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here and for giving me the opportunity to share some insights from solutions in that context of hazardous substances, of micropollutants. And I try to go a little bit along the questions I understood from the emails, what you're interested in. And the first one is, of course, do we have the tools to monitor these complex mixtures we have in the field? And from my point of view, there is a clear answer, and that is yes. And one of these tools is, of course, effect-based monitoring. There we suggested in solutions test battery, including in vivo assays focusing on the biological quality elements, fish, daphnia, and algae, and if necessary, bacteria, and complement that with proxies for long-term effects, and that means in vitro assays, where we are there with endocrine disruption, metabolism, reactive toxicity, and so on. So there are nice tools around, and what is the strength of these nice tools? It's of course that they detect all the chemicals that cause the effect we are interested in. We don't need any knowledge on the compounds, and we directly consider the mixture effects. And I think, well, acute toxicity and a few sublethal effects are well covered. So I think it's a nice tool and a strong tool to identify water bodies of concern where we have to have a deeper look. There's, of course, always a but, and the but here is, of course, that many sublethal effects so far are not considered. You may see that in that little graph on top, where we just had a look on modes of action of chemicals we typically find in the water body. And I have to tell you, it's only a part of these modes of action we can really detect. And I think there are a few more things to be kept in mind. First of all is, of course, we are, and that's good, we are not in the area anymore where we have real acute toxicity. That means the fish are dying, but we are in the sublethal area, and nevertheless, that plays an important role, you will see later on. But that in this context, that means we always need enrichment in order to use effect-based monitoring tools. We have to be careful with masking effects and blanks and so on. And of course, we get information on the effects, but not on the drivers of the effects. So from my point of view, it's clear that we have to combine effect-based monitoring also with chemical monitoring, with chemical screening. And that's also something we worked on there in solutions, and we really can recommend. So non-target screening as the basis of the whole thing, where you see all the chemicals that are in your sample, of course, within the domain of the method. That's something we have to discuss maybe, and well, typically more than 10,000 chemicals. It's a nice early warning tool, so you see emerging peaks, spills, and so on, and there is a lot of experience in that field, for example, already in the Rhine River monitoring, where they did that. This is just one of the examples you see here. You can use these data for digital freezing, for retrospective analysis. So in 10 years or in 20 years, you can look back and try to see how the contamination developed. GC and LC high-resolution mass spectrometry, that's what you need for that, is increasingly available, also in routine monitoring stations. And it's a nice basis, of course, for target screening at the end. And at the moment, at least in our lab, we have about 1,200 known chemicals we always screen in our target screening. That's the basis then also for the component-based mixture risk assessment. And the bottleneck of the whole thing is always the data evaluation, because you get a lot of data out of that kind of screening. But there's good news too, and so there are high throughput automated workflows which are well in development or in our lab already in use, where we can really deal with these large LC and GC HRMS data sets. So, but again, as with the effect-based tool, there is a but, of course. There is something you should be careful. Of course, also the non-target screening does not see everything. So it fails, for example, to detect highly active chemicals at their effect thresholds, for example, endocrine disrupting steroids and others. Not well-behaving chemicals, so which are not ionizing or show a poor chromatography, they might be overlooked. And detecting chemicals does not mean that you identify the chemicals. So you don't care, you're not able to write a name beside it. And for the risk assessment, finally, there's a big lack of effect data still for even frequently detected chemicals we find in the environment. So these gaps need to be closed, of course. And I think still, just to repeat that, we need a combination of effect-based and chemical monitoring. So just maybe a few words about what you can get out of that. And in that case, I focus now on the chemical assessment. And from solutions, we have the nice thing that, well, we have a nice data treasure, let's say, because we had a lot of river basins we had a look at. So we did non-target screening on about 800 surface waters and about 50 wastewater treatment plant effluents, and evaluated them for the 1,200 chemicals, all with a harmonized method. So I think that's a really nice thing, because data are really comparable. Also, you see already that there are also gaps. So it's not all over Europe, but it's where we have been, of course. And the question is, do we have a toxic risk in European water resources? And just evaluating these data, for example, we come up with, let's say, 1/3, 1/4 of the samples where we have no or low risk. All the others, there is a risk, of course, in many cases a chronic risk, but also an acute risk to fish, to algae, and to crustaceans. And well, the biggest problem is obviously here for algae and crustaceans. If you have a look on the wastewater treatment plant effluents, then it's even worse, of course, because it's not diluted with the river water, so it shifts a bit to the right, but the picture is the same. So the lowest risk for fish and the highest risk for algae and Daphnia. Of course, that's based on acute toxicity data. So as soon as we consider endocrine disruption and things like that, it will change this figure. What are the major risk drivers? I think that's also important, and we did that, of course, for all these data sets, and that's just a first idea for you. So crustaceans, Daphnia in that case. We have a lot of pesticides, of course, insecticides, and also in some cases fungicides, which play an important role. These are the green ones with diacinone, fipronil, and others on the very top. And if you go for algae, it looks different, but not with the colors. So if we have the same coloring for herbicides as for insecticides, it's again, well, the pesticides, which are very much in front, but for the algae also together with some pharmaceuticals and particularly antibiotic chemicals. So, and maybe as a last thing, so I was told that we want to interrupt and then continue. So as a last thing, the question, is it really mixture risks or is it individual compounds? And so we just did a little, very simple evaluation of these data and just checked how many compounds substantially contribute to the risk. And you see it's very few with only one compound, but for Daphnia, for example, it's typically 5, 4, 5, 6 compounds contributing. For algae, it's 8, 9, 10 compounds, and for fish, it's even more. So the idea behind that is really there are mixture effects. These mixture effects, they are of relevance. Shall we stop here and discuss that first, and I continue then, or shall I continue?
No, that's great, Werner, because we actually have some first 2 questions coming in of our live audience, so thank you for that. Anne van Brugge sent in a question, but that is more related to the policy effect, so I'll ask that to our panel once we are a little further down in this first discussion round. And then someone who wrote their name as anonymous. It's always a pity. I'd love to know who you are, but you have reasons maybe not to. Is they're looking for tweetable quotes, Werner. So, what is the key urgency of effect-based monitoring in the EU? How would you summarize that? You've just shown that the effect is real, that there is a mixture and accumulation effect. But what defines the urgency?
The urgency of monitoring, or
of monitoring
what we have to develop.
On effects. Yes.
Well, I think there are several urgencies. First of all, we have to demonstrate effect-based monitoring on a larger scale and show that it really works. And I think everything we saw showed that it works, but we have to convince, of course, our stakeholders and people in the monitoring stations. And I think we also have to extend it, particularly with respect to the modes of action. So my concern is there are several endpoints which are not really well covered. And neurotoxicity is one of these endpoints, for example. And I would love to see more projects dealing with developing, let's say, high throughput effect-based monitoring tools for this kind of mode of action, for example.
So basically what you're saying, Werner, is we're having blind spots, right?
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And
we're still having blind spots.
Yeah, great. Yeah, please.
Yeah, we are on a tight schedule, Mr. Brack, so a short question in between. Do you think over time, is there knowledge about it, that the black spots are increasing in a way? The number of black spots?
No, if no, if something is increasing, then it's well, the knowledge is increasing, and of course the awareness of black spots is also a bit increasing. But on the other hand, I think we have really strong tools we should really apply now.
Okay.
So it's not, we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for anything, but we should always keep in mind that there are these black spots, and we should try to close them. And I don't think that the black spots are increasing. The awareness is increasing, and that's a good thing.
Okay.
Beautiful. Thank you. Well, please resume with the second and last part of your introduction.
Okay, so I think there's another thing I would like to share you, and that's the question, are chemical mixtures really driving also the poor ecological status? And that's something we tried to do together with another big project, the Mars project, and a bit also with Globaqua. And there we did an evaluation of Europe-wide data on chemicals and the ecological status. And the outcome was that it's 1/3 for each of them. So 1/3 is driven by habitat, 1/3 of the poor ecological status by nutrients, and 1/3 about really by toxicity, by toxicants. So they play an important role, not only for the chemical status, but particularly for the ecological status. And I think that needs to be considered. And this link between both needs to be enhanced. So there was one more question, and that was a question, are emissions sufficiently controlled? And I can say, at least from our experience, also here in Germany, there is a clear no, because hazardous effects are often caused by non-regulated and non-monitored chemicals. Just a few examples without going into detail. So one of the wastewater treatment plants here not far away we dealt with was emitting, or is still emitting, highly active anti-androgenic chemicals, a fluorescent dye, which is coming from, we don't know that yet, but the response of the authorities is, well, is this a priority substance? Is this regulated? No, it's not. So is it interesting for us? And another one, just one wastewater treatment plant. Further, it's about mutagenicity. So there is a lot of mutagenicity coming out of that. And it's we identified diaminophenazines from dye production behind that. Again, chemicals which are not regulated, which are not monitored, and for many regulators which are not interesting. So because of this lack of regulation. Yeah, and as a last thing, the question, is there hope? So do we get the wastewater treatment plants or the wastewater treatment plant effluents, do we get them cleaner? And I think, yes, there is hope. And one of the case studies we had a look at in solutions was this upgrade of wastewater treatment plants in Switzerland, and checking before and afterwards, upstream, downstream, how and if the situation is improving. And just to, well, we did that with chemical screening, with effect-based monitoring, but also with ecological monitoring. And in all we saw substantial improvement. That's definitely true. And here to show you just one example, and that's well, about ecological monitoring, let's say having a look on pollution-induced community tolerance. So typically in polluted areas, we have more tolerant communities. That's nothing good in that case. That just means that the sensitive species are already wiped out in a way. And that's what we see here on the right side. So upstream, we have a much a lower sensitivity than down, a higher sensitivity than downstream. And as soon as you really come up with an upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant, that's what you see here for the wastewater treatment plant of Herisau, then there is no difference anymore. So that's really technology around that helps to improve water quality. Yeah, that's it from my side. That's all I prepared for you. That's just the consortium of solutions, because it's of course not my work, but the work of a large number of wonderful scientists all over Europe.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Mr. Werner Brack. Virtual applause, I think, from our audience. If you're on Twitter or LinkedIn, use hashtag hazardous substances or hashtag Rli-online to share your key insights. Quite some people are starting to send in comments and questions. Great job. René Vreugdenheel, Jos Bessems, Leon de Porter, thank you very much. We'll store those questions for now, and you can read through that list and actually with a thumbs up determine which questions you want us to submit to our Blue Room. But first, we would like to go to a second presenter who we've asked to reflect on the outcomes of the report. She's with us from Copenhagen, Denmark, if I'm correct, Senja. She is the project manager of the European Environment Agency and currently leading the project Chemicals of Concern in Articles in the Circular Economy and the coordinator of the module for environment and human biomonitoring. Senja Tvier, good morning.
Nee, geeft niks. Zeg maar.
I think someone has still their mic open. We're waiting till we switch to Senja. Senja, good morning. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, good morning, everybody, and thanks for this invitation.
Great. Thanks for being with us. And also, we've asked you to prepare a short first introduction into your reflections on the recommendations of the Council. So please take it away.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm just checking, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
And I will go here. Is it on?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to present here. I was also given some questions that I will try and address. I will start out by presenting some of the urgency needed as we have identified in our State and Outlook of the Environment report for 2020, which was published December last year. And then I'll go on and reflect a little bit on what is the 10 recommendations of the report. And then finally, I will focus in on one of them, which is the safe by design or the safe and sustainable by design. So starting with what we found in the State and Outlook of the Environment report, there was a special chemicals chapter on chemical pollution. And the way that we try to illustrate the systemic view on chemicals is that the chemical pollution is caused by human activity. So we have the humans here inside the house sphere or a built environment. Then we are surrounded by a technosphere where we use these chemicals. They're produced, they're manufactured, then they go to some kind of waste and maybe waste collection and recycled. But at the same time, we also have activities in the ecosphere where we produce food. We also extract minerals and we also have fishing and oil extraction, etc. And the thing is that all these chemicals can then be emitted from either point source, so that could be a point source, could be a factory, or diffuse sources, such as when we spread it in the environment or they are transported across the globe. And while we have a rather good grip on point source emissions, diffuse emissions are less well described. Secondly, it also occurs across the life cycle. So from the time a chemical is produced until it is ends its life, it can change form, but it can also be emitted during production, use, and disposal. And a key point that we found was that chemicals do accumulate in the environment and in people and in products, but there they build up and added, and onto that is added all the other chemicals that we continue to use. So we not only have to think about what is currently emitted every year, but we also have to think that it's not a pristine environment that we emitted into. There's already something there. And secondly, we also have accumulation of effects, and that could be, for instance, if you have a pregnant woman here who are exposed to the bisphenol A mentioned before, which is an endocrine disruption chemical. And then the child is affected, but sometimes these effects can be passed on to future generations. And that accumulation of effects is something else which is not very well reflected in our assessment of chemicals. And finally, you can say all of these impacts where we have focused on the chemicals, they have effects not just on the for the single substances, but for the mixtures. And it's this total burden of chemicals that really affect people, just as Vanna Brack just presented. And this is just a short view of how you can also look at chemicals in a systemic view, that you start from raw materials, you have production, you have use, and you have waste treatment, and then hopefully you can close the loop here in the circular economy. But along all these activities, you have leakages, which is also mentioned in the report, and leakages to air, to water, to soil, and to people in the environment. So again, urgency. Well, there are many numbers out there. We assessed that it was about 100,000 of chemicals which are like mainly in use or present in the environment. And the way that we risk manage these chemicals now is that to assess the risk, we have to know the hazard and the exposure. And in some cases, we have very good understanding of the hazards, but we have little information on the exposure. And that means that we can actually not very scientifically assess the risk. And this was what led to this picture here, where we have the top of the iceberg, a rather few number of chemicals out of 100,000 chemicals are thoroughly assessed for both their hazards and exposures across environmental media. And these volumes are increasing, and we can see globally they're increasing, and the chemical diversity is increasing. There's a humongous number of chemicals being added to the list of existing chemicals every day. Not all of those are used, but the point is, as long as we don't have a good understanding of it, how can we then be sure that we're not getting into a situation where it's kind of running out of control? So we need to think about other risk management tools that can add on to the ones that we have already. And this was just the summary assessment from the chemicals chapter. I don't want you to read all the details, but the point is, both for the emissions of chemicals, the chemical pollution and impacts on these ecosystems and on human health and well-being, when we look towards 2030, it's deteriorating development, but also the ability to meet the policy objectives and targets, they are largely not on track. And those targets are across chemicals policies, but it's also the 7th Environmental Action Programme. And with that, I'm coming to the Dutch report, and I just took this picture out of it. It shows, again, a view of the world where you have production, you have product use, you have end of life, and you have different policies addressing various stages. And meanwhile, all these activities cause emissions into the physical environment. And they have produced 10 recommendations, which are listed here, but I will just summarize them here in the next slide. So the first recommendation is to have a further track and trace. And there I picked out that there's a focus on better understanding of the volumes and uses of these chemicals. And I think this is a really important recommendation, because imagining that we should monitor all these chemicals, even if we have group methods, I mean, it's a humongous task and it's very costly. And it's also very time consuming, so we might not be able to act in time. So therefore, we need also to make better use of modeling. And for that, you need information about the volumes, the identity of the chemicals, and where they're used. And this you can then use for exposure and fate models. The Safe by Design, I will come back to that, but I think it's a really important activity that addresses how we in the future could make smarter use of chemicals to achieve our needs, but reducing the negative impacts on health. Societal pressure, yes, I think this is important. I think awareness is a key component here. And I think actually in combination with the more frequent compliance checks, which is mentioned in point number 8, which will come down here, this could be one of the ways to achieve that. So when you check for compliance and you communicate that to society, usually that is what creates interest. Just like the tin mentioned earlier, you become aware that there's something in the food you're eating. The positive list, I will not go into details with that. There are many pros and cons. I think one of the advantages is that you can have a list of what to monitor for. The negative is that you might only monitor for that and then you ignore the rest. You can also, with the positive list, you have an assessment of the chemicals actually monitored. So there's some pros and cons there. Material passports, yes, it's mentioned often in the circular economy. It's also very detailed. and maybe it's more detailed than, I mean, it again takes a lot of effort. And will you actually get the chemicals that are also relevant, like the degradation products in materials? But jumping then to number 6, temporary environmental permits, I think that could be very effective in updating both risk assessment and risk management options. So I think that is an interesting proposal. And the use of counter expertise and permits, yes, it was demonstrated it works. So for the next, sorry, it should have been 8, 9, 10 here. They mentioned enforcement and compliance checking and increased capacity and knowledge of authorities. This is really very important, especially if you can increase frequency of testing to demonstrate, that what we are doing is actually working. But I think in order to support that, we need to have methods that are fit for enforcement as well. And those are often not the same methods as those that are fit for research. And often when we fund research, we will fund research methods, but not enforcement methods and compliance methods. And they really have different purposes. You need to have standardized methods where you have one result, is it compliant, non-compliant. They have to be fairly cheap, especially also if you want to transmit them through a supply chain. And there a question could be, could we look into more grouping methods? An example is for the PFAS, these fluorinated chemicals, maybe we could use a total organic fluorine method of some kind that can monitor the total amount. And then the question is, where do you then set a reasonable limit that it has to be compliant with? But that's a different discussion. Then the cumulative effects and exposure assessed in risk assessment. Yes, Vanna Brack also rightly mentioned that this is definitely something we need to consider, and we do need to consider it across all the legislation, so we have coherent legislation. And there are pragmatic methods such as the mixture risk assessment, mixture risk assessment factor, the MAF, could be something that could be relevant. And finally, on the monitoring the toxic pressure, I think this is again important. I highlighted the toxic pressure because I think one of the things that we found in the State and Outlook of the Environment report was that there are very few studies explaining how a chemical concentration can cause a certain effect. So linking these pressures or the concentrations to the impacts on the environment particularly is really important. And it was very nice to see in the study also just presented that they could actually assess these a third of toxicants causing the impact, but we need more of those studies. And then maybe also the more methods that can measure the groups and classes. And as Vanna just said, not all the targeted or non-targeted methods could detect the chemicals. So we need to complement them both with biological methods, but also with chemical group methods. So some further reflections. Many of the recommendations of the report is primarily aimed at reducing future pollution, which is very good. It's very effective. Preventing pollution is the most effective tool to achieve the goals. But I think we also need to think about what to do with what we already have here. For instance, we have a lot of materials that are polluted already. What should we do that? How to clean up the circular economy and achieve clean material cycles. Also remediation of soil and water, and consider who should it be legal actions, which technologies do we need, and who should pay for it, because this can be costly. And then secondly, there was a little bit of mentioning, but not a lot, of the financial instruments that could support these policy goals. I think the investment in safer chemicals and products is needed. It's what we also need to have to support the safe and sustainable by design. However, it's not free of cost, and there's a lot of logins, and we have to consider how to support investment in better technologies in the future. And another thing which is often not discussed so much, but the socioeconomic assessments, play a key role in which chemicals that we are allowing onto the market or not. And I think we need to take a closer look at these methods. Do they actually deliver on the goals we have right now? Can they take accumulation of chemicals and effects into account over time? Currently, they're not very good at that. And what are the essential use for society, which might be different from the essential use for a business? And then liability. It has been proposed in the past to have anticipatory insurance bonds. It's already used for oil. It's used for bank, so in the financial sector, and it's used for risks from radioactivity, so nuclear activities. But these insurance bonds could help give a break for those who take good measures and provide safer chemicals, and then it will cost more for those who have not taken those precautions. And with that, I'm going into the safe and sustainable by design. I just wanted to check if I should continue. I have 2 more slides.
Yeah, well, you're well over time, Senja, and I also want to make sure that we have enough time for our Blue Room participants. So do you feel that there is a key message still lacking? Because you gave us a very extensive overview.
Okay, what I will do, I will then do it very quickly here. The safe and sustainable by design, basically, the idea is that you have an enabling environment that requires policies, education, and support centers. But then you go in and design a product that delivers both on performance and also on circularity and function. You consider the service to provide, but then you consider what are the impacts across the life cycle and how does it impact what you want to protect. And finally, you need to have some acceptance criteria of which are better than the others. And there, the important message is that we have to consider these sustainability goals, but without compromising safety. So there has to be a minimum, let's say, performance for each of the criteria. And that is a societal decision also what that should be. And that is then what is needed here to move ahead on the safe and sustainable by design. And I just highlighted some of the key things: strong policy environment. You have to develop the methods to assess these impacts. You have to develop and standardize methods for the assessment criteria. And here it's important to bring in science and society. And then focus on education and also to set up technical support centers. And with that, I want to thank you for listening. And if you want to contact me further, this is my email address. And yes, I'll pass it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much, Senja Trier. And of course, very interesting. And thank you for giving us this overview, and important for you to add the safe by design as a key principle for the future circular economy. So it's a very important point to add. I just want to make sure I have enough time to also introduce our members of the Blue Room who have also been listening and who've been an important part of this reflection here this morning. First of all, from Stockholm in Sweden, we have Christina Ruden with us, who is a professor in regulatory ecotoxicology and who has been the author of the Swedish government advisory report on the combination effects of chemicals in the environment, which has also been an important cornerstone for this report, and has also been ending up on the desk of our Ministry of Environment. Yep. So good morning, Christina. Thank you for being with us. Next to you is Steven van der Broek. He is the Director of REACH and Chemicals Policy at CEFIC. And CEFIC is the European Chemical Industry Council, representing industry. Good morning, Steven. Thank you for being with us as well. And we have also with us André van der Zande. André was together with you on the Council of Environment and Infrastructure in the committee for this report. Thank you for being with us as well, André. We're glad you're with us. We also see quite a lot of people have found their way into the questions and answer box. Leonard van Maart, Albert de Jong, Armand Domen. A lot of questions. Well, our time is scarce. We have about 10, 12 minutes here. So now there's an invitation to you as an audience to read through those questions and use the thumbs up of which questions you really want to prioritize and want Co and me to answer together with our Blue Room panels. But I'll start with my panel. Christina, if I can start with you. Do you share the observation of the Council that the cumulative exposure is such an important issue and is actually a blind spot in the regulatory framework?
Yes, I definitely share that analysis. The current legislative framework almost exclusively focuses on single chemicals. So much of the things that we do really assume that every single chemical is emitted into its own pristine environment, which is obviously unrealistic. So we actually, it's quite urgent, I think, that we add the aspect of mixtures and cumulative exposure to the current system.
And what is, from your Swedish perspective, in your advisory report, what would you say is the key method to address this issue?
Well, the major issue is, of course, the unintentional mixtures, the mixtures that occur during the processes that Senja showed very nice overviews of. And of course, given the number of individual substances, the number of potential mixtures is just overwhelming. There is no way that we can ever address them sort of one by one. To do it in a really science-based way would require a lot of data gathering and a lot of development of methods and models and so on. And given the state of the urgency, I really promote the more pragmatic way of introducing a mixture assessment factor, or what we call it an allocation factor in my report, but it's basically a similar approach. It's certainly pragmatic, and the size of that factor, we don't know exactly. It will be different, of course, for different mixtures. But the system as it is right now is based on a lot of assumptions, a lot of simplifications and modeling, and also pragmatic approaches. We already have assessment factors that are sometimes too big and sometimes too small. So this is nothing new to the system. And I think what we know now, the science is really, really clear that the regulatory system underestimates the risks. So in our report, we recommend a factor of 10 to be introduced as fast as possible.
Oh, wow. That's a very strong recommendation. Thank you for sharing that, Christina. Ko, before I go to Stephen, one of the questions from people in the audience is also kind of related to, well, the literal question is, were the current actions of industry also taken into considerations when these recommendations were written down?
A good question, of course, but we even had a member, external member in our committee, Annette Wilschut, and she's an employee of the Royal DSM. So, and of course you need to cope with the industry and to set up a dialogue with them as well. So we did, yeah, for sure.
Well, let's open up that dialogue with industry. Steven van der Broek from Civic, do you, as a representative of the industry, also recognize this urgency for taking into account the cumulative effects?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Indeed, well, I see a lot of, there is indeed the last few years, a lot of debate on combined exposure, and it's not a new topic. So that's quite clear. And I see the eagerness of policymaker regulators to move forward on this one, and which we can fully understand. And we're happy to, let's say, to explore different options. How can we take this better on board? As Ms. Ruden just mentioned, today, it's, let's say, there's only a very specific regulations where this issue is clearly addressed. So we understand we need to also think and reflect about how can we take on board in other regulatory frameworks. My only word of caution would be here that we need to be careful, because I hear a lot, again, pragmatism. We need to find an operational way forward. We just need to be careful that we are not putting a very simple solution in place to address a very complex problem. And in that sense, I really like the presentation of Mr. Brak, who brought a few issues forward, like the effect-based monitoring, the non-target screening, which I believe are very valuable tools that can help us understand what are now the real mixtures, the combined exposure that really matters, and where we really need to have focus upon and put in place, let's say, additional measures or assessments to better understand what they are doing and how can we tackle them in the most effective way.
All right, thank you very much. Point to move forward. Let's not oversimplify. A question I want to pose to André, as one of the co-authors of this report as well. You might be able to fill this in. It's a question from Albert de Jong and backed up by 7 people already. Senja Trier mentioned in her presentation something about liabilities for toxications. And the question is, what is exactly the legal basis for these liabilities? There's not a general rule on the European level, is that correct? On what basis could we see if we can direct the industry?
Well, I think it's correct. There is a lot of legal systems here involved, and by implication, a lot of liabilities also. It's different when you have a permit to emit some chemicals into a water body. You have a permit from the water body authority, and if you emit too much, then you can be brought to court. It's a different thing when you have a file in REACH, or you have a file in our medicine regulatory system. So this is one of the complexities we also address. And I think, yes, when we need robust answers to very complex systems, we cannot do it one by one. I think this is the bottom line. And we have been also going to court. It's nicotine we are addressing. It's one compound. So we are also in terms of liability, it's one chemical, we go to court, like we had the examples in the Netherlands. And we also have to answer when we have 10 compounds in the mixture who are responsible. How are we going to find a legal base for these 10 compounds together? And is it the last one coming in, or is it the earlier ones in the water body? So this is, I think, where our conceptual framework, because if you have measures, cleaning up your water bodies, cleaning up your product lines, then you have to have, I think, robust proof. And I was very much appealing by the remarks about our implementators and our inspectorates. They need to have proof. And I think the pathway from having mixtures, having adverse effects to, less adverse mixtures, I think scientists still have to come up with some robust answers. And yes, safe by design is the beginning of upfront solution, but safe by design is not solving the whole body of mixtures already out there in our soils, in our waters, in our systems. So improving our existing waters, soils, etc. There we have the temporary, the board has the idea of the temporary permits using the state of technology we have, but we can't clean all our waters through sewage systems. It's impossible. So we have to still have to find some answers, what I call the pathways to solutions. And I would challenge the scientific community to think further on that. Thank you.
Thank you, André van der Zande. I would like to round off this first round of discussion with a last question to my panel, which has been receiving a lot of votes from our viewers. It's submitted by Jan-Willem Sla, and it's about one of the measures proposed, the one on safe by design. And it relates very much to discussion when we started, that the general public needs to understand this difference between hazardous substances and the products they come across. Jan-Willem writes, on safe by design, how would you define safe chemicals? As all chemicals can be considered toxic depending on the dose. So how could we explain to the public that there is a difference between safe and unsafe chemicals? Let's have a look at our panel who would like to have a first idea of how we can deal with this. Christina, I see you unmute yourself. Come in, please.
Yeah, I can have a go. I think one problem with the system today is that we go for, we have two states of the world. Either a chemical is safe or it's not safe. And in reality, we span from very toxic chemical to very untoxic chemicals. So I think it would be better if we have a system that actually reflects that there is a big gray zone here. And that we have a system that strives to continuously reduce risks by substitution from hazardous chemicals to less hazardous substances, but also, of course, to limit the amount of chemicals and find non-chemical solutions. The precautionary principle is very important in EU environmental and chemical law, but the substitution principle is not as systematically implemented. So that's another thing that I think we could actually strengthen on the European level to promote substitution, innovation, and also that will help to work towards a circular economy, of course.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very clear directive, I think, also for policymakers listening. Anybody else from the panel? Yeah, Senja, would you like to comment on how can we explain to the public safe and unsafe?
Yes, exactly. Well, I want to come back to the tool that Werner mentioned, because it has been proposed by some of the people who were behind the green chemistry concept, which was in some ways similar to the safe and sustainable by design. There they propose that you actually test the final product with, let's say, bio-based methods, and you set up criteria for what is acceptable and not acceptable. And in many ways, this is similar to the approach today. You put some limits, and if it's above that, you consider it unsafe. And I think this could be one way forward for the product. But in the starting phase, I think it's also trying to avoid using the chemicals we already now know are unsafe. And just like Christina said, I mean, there are many hazardous chemicals that are still in use. They're still allowed to be used. If we can just lower the known hazardous substances and stop using them, then we will also lower the risk for the overall product.
Thank you, Senja, for contributing. And let's go for a final word to Steven van der Broek as representative of the industry, because I assume you have been dealing with this all the time already. This is not new for you.
That's not new. That's not new at all. I think a few reflections, if I may. I think what Ms. Ruden just mentioned, it's also important. It's always important to keep in mind one hazardous substance is not necessarily the other one. There is a large range of hazardous substances. So this differences sometimes get a bit lost when we talk about hazardous substances as a whole. We need to reduce all hazardous substances. I think that there's a distinction to be made. For example, has been made within the REACH regulation, where you have substances of very high concern versus other hazardous substances. So that's one element. The second element I would like to bring forward, safe by design. Yes, but I think for us, what we are seeing today, it's not only about safe by design, it's about safe and sustainable by design. The sustainable element is also, let's say, is broader. It includes safety, and safety is indeed, it's a clear, let's say, pillar of sustainable by design. But there are so many other elements we have to take into account. If we think about circular economy, we need to reflect upon what are these chemicals also delivering for a circular economy. And I will just use one example, and that just to show the complexity of this debate. If you look at cobalt as such is a very hazardous chemical, because it's a carcinogenic agent. At the same time, we need this cobalt to build batteries in order to be able to deliver on the whole energy transition. So you see, these are the kind of, let's say, these will be the very difficult questions that need to be answered the coming years, also by policymakers and by industry, in order to move forward. So just again, for us, it's safe and sustainable by design, and we need to look at a holistic way in this whole debate and these questions.
Well, thank you, Steven. And I think it's already kind of hopeful that we don't step into this very classical archetype of industry saying this can be done. It's actually Steven van der Broek saying we need to be talking about safe and sustainable. So I'm very optimistic hearing that.
Just a few words. Thank you for joining today. But it's a triangle between government, society, we all as a consumer, but also the industry and well, you all acknowledge that, so that's a good start.
So with that, if we all acknowledge that, I think we can round off the first round of reflections and discussions. Thank you to our panel, Christina Ruden, Werner Brak, of course, for the introduction, Senja Trier, Steven van der Broek, and André van der Zande. Please stay with us, because later we'll pull you back in when we talk to Diederik Samsom about how this relates to EU policy. But for now, we're going to have a short micro break of 2 minutes when we look at a second part of that video where we see some more reflections on the recommendations. It allows you to pick up your laptop, go to the coffee machine and get a fresh cup of coffee before we continue into the second part of discussion where we focus on who is to take action. But now, let's further watch that video.
En een belangrijke aanbeveling is dat inwoners en maatschappelijke groeperingen ook het wettelijk recht geven om bedrijven ook te kunnen uitdagen om minder gevaarlijke stoffen te gebruiken. Die inwoners en die maatschappelijke groeperingen hebben vaak veel kennis en ook veel netwerken, ook internationaal. Dat zouden we heel erg goed kunnen benutten.
Wanneer ik naar het hele rapport kijk, is er misschien één onderwerp wat onderbelicht is gebleven. En dat is de gedragskant. Het gedrag van producenten, handelaren, verwerkers en ook van consumenten. Als ik naar COVID-19 kijk en de crisisbeheersing die daar van toepassing is, dan komt het uiteindelijk allemaal aan op gedrag. Gedrag van burgers, gedrag van iedereen in de keten. Alleen op die manier kunnen we COVID-19 beheersen. En ik denk dat dat ook voor greep op gevaarlijke stoffen een belangrijke factor is. De gedragskant. Dus ik beveel aan ook daar aandacht aan te besteden.
Invoeren van materiaalpaspoorten zijn essentieel om de transparantie te geven over de chemische samenstelling van producten. De gebruikelijke safety datasheets zijn niet toereikend om deze transparantie van eindproducten te waarborgen.
Het veilig omgaan met stoffen in de circulaire economie is niet alleen een verantwoordelijkheid van de chemische industrie. Het is een belang voor de hele keten. Het is duidelijk dat hier transparantie bij nodig is. En zoals de staatssecretaris in haar brief al aangeeft, moet die transparantie toch minimaal op Europees niveau geregeld worden, liefst op wereldschaal. Materialen bewegen uiteindelijk over de hele wereld. In bepaalde gevallen is het gebruik van zorgstoffen wel van belang. Bijvoorbeeld voor veiligheid of voor de benodigde energietransitie. Denk aan materialen voor medische hulpmiddelen of zonnecellen of in windmolens. Maar dat zijn stoffen die natuurlijk niet in speelgoed horen. Het gaat hier om essentieel gebruik.
Yes, Ko. So we move on to the second round. We've underlined the urgency of the recommendations in the report. We've validated the analysis of the recommendations in the report. Now it's time to turn this into action. If you're just joining us, we are here with the Council of Environment and Infrastructure talking about the report, A Grip on Hazardous Substances, a national Dutch report, but we're trying to leverage that into a European context. Ko, just before the video you already introduced, it's a triangle. Yep. And if we're not careful, it's everybody looking at the other. Who's going to move first?
Yeah, and I think the first question to ask is, what can we do? So for me, it was like an eye-opener that me as a consumer, I consider myself and a lot of my friends and family as a responsible citizen. But I'm not aware what is in every product I use. So you need to grow awareness. So the first question is, what can I do as a consumer? And of course, industry and government as well.
Exactly. Now, just like in the first round, we've asked two experts to give us a short 10-minute presentation and reflection. I'll be talking to Anne-Sophie Becker, Executive Director of ChemSec, which is a non-governmental organization with the mission to achieve a world free of hazardous chemicals. And ChemSec is also famous for their sin list, Substitute Now, where they produce materials and substances that can be used instead of hazardous substances. And after Anne-Sophie, I'll be talking to Marco Mensink, who is the Executive Director of CEFIC, the European Council of Chemical Industry. But first to Anne-Sophie. Anne-Sophie, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Let's see if we can hear and see you okay. Yes, there you are. Good morning. Welcome that you're with us this morning. We've also asked you to prepare a short presentation of leading us into the topic of who is to act and how can we do it. Please take it away.
Thanks. Thank you very much. The recovery plan, the EU Green Deal with the chemicals strategy and the circular economy plan are very, very important. And these strategies present either a huge threat or a great opportunity to protect the environment and to tackle widespread health problems linked to chemicals. I want to outline what I see we can do with this great opportunity, as I prefer to call it, and link it to the proposals made by the RLI Council. The discussions about circular economy are mainly about reaching quantitative recycling goals instead of talking about the quality of the recycling. But it is the chemical content of a product that decides about the recyclability of the product. So chemicals are the kind of elephant in the room when we talk about circular economy. Or rather, it's not discussed. However, a circular economy needs to be non-toxic, otherwise it's deemed to fail. And why? There are many reasons, but I would like to highlight two of them. First, if we recycle materials containing hazardous chemicals, it will change the perception of recycling for the general public. Will citizens want to buy recycled products? Will we go to the recycling stations with our packaging materials? if we found out that recycled material contains hazardous chemicals? And the second, there are many progressive brands that want to expand their use of recycled materials in their products. But using recycled materials with unknown chemical content is a huge commercial risk. What if it's toxic and this is later found out? And the fact is that we don't know the content of the chemicals in recycled material. A sturdy power cable labeled for outdoor use due to heavy phthalate content can suddenly be reborn as a plastic toy. And this is an actual scenario, it's not a made up one. So we have to ask ourselves, how will a circular economy work if no one wants to buy or use recycled materials? So we need to strive towards a non-toxic circular economy in both the recovery plan, the Green Deal with the Circular Economy Action Plan, and the chemical strategy. Chemicals should become a part of the solution for circular economy, not a hinder for recycling. And to manage this, the recommendations made by R&I play an important role. To me, the most important one is transparency and traceability. A tracking system is needed. Otherwise, we will never manage to get clean material streams. In addition to your recommendations that are important, I would like to add 2 more recommendations. First, regulations of hazardous chemicals. It is regulations, and in particular, the anticipation of regulation that drives innovation towards safer chemicals. When industry expects regulations to be regularly tightening up, innovations are spurred. And of course, we have to tackle mixtures as well, in line with the suggestions made by Professor Rydén. The second recommendation I would like you to add on is that we need to apply equivalent chemical requirements for recycled and virgin material. If European Union allows for hazardous chemicals in recycled material to a larger and higher extent than in virgin material, it will eventually make companies doubt the safety of the products made from recycled material. So to add these 2 recommendations would make sense. The question is how to get your recommendations to become reality. Who should act? And that I will talk more about after the Slido question.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Anne-Sophie, for adding these first 2 recommendations. At the moment, we have many questions, but not so much on your specific part yet. So for the sake of time and to allow some more time for discussion later, let me invite our viewers to go through the list, thumbs up and promote the questions you really like to be asked. And for now, Anne-Sophie, please continue with the next, second part.
Okay, thanks. So there are many voices that want to continue with business as usual. And normally, political actions are too slow or too vague to really make a shift. But now we have the opportunity, thanks to the recovery plan and the Green Deal, to set the direction for the society we want. So the trick is really to make it happen. So how to do it? I think that some companies have realized that man-made hazardous chemicals is a commercial risk for their business. That are mainly frontrunners among chemical companies and consumer clothes companies, often companies that care very much about the reputation. However, we need to create the conditions for man-made hazardous chemicals to be a commercial risk for all of companies. And to do that, we need 2 things. First, we need a clear message from policymakers that the aim is to achieve a non-toxic circular economy, followed by legal actions as suggested with transparency and regulations. And the second, we need to secure the market for businesses producing or using safer chemicals by stimulating public procurement, requirements on product design. We need to support positive lists. And actually right now, political decision makers on both national and EU level should decide that each company that will be financially supported has an exchange to sign up to certain environmental commitments, such as building a transparent chemical supply chain. And these concrete actions could also be a real saver for the EU-based industry, both for chemical companies and for downstream users, because the incentives should actively promote Made in Europe. Most important actor are all political decision makers, both on national and EU level, of course. But other actors are also play a role. My organization, ChemSec, will next week launch a scoring of the world's largest stock exchange listed chemical companies, among them 2 Dutch companies and 33 other ones. And what we want to achieve with that is really to get investors to invest in the front runner and to start a dialogue with the laggers. I must say, I oppose that we put too much burden on consumers to find out if a product is safe or not. It's up to legislators to make sure that our daily life products are safe. And that is what citizens expect from decision makers. I would also like to point out when we're talking about circular economy that chemical recycling is not the solution. Workers will still be exposed during production, and people exposed during the use of products would remain. And I'm afraid that the development towards desired types of plastics would be hampered, since all kinds of plastic can be mixed and cracked in chemical recycling. Coming to the end, to me, the RLI recommendations are well thought through, and they show the way we need to go. The most important recommendation is transparency and traceability. A tracking system is needed. And please add the 2 more recommendations I presented to tighten up regulations and apply same rules for virgin and recycled material. But the tough thing is, of course, how to make this become reality. And to manage that, we need to secure the market for businesses producing or using safer chemicals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie Bakker, Executive Director of ChemTech, for this very powerful speech, very concrete actions and measures. And I think everyone in Europe has been listening to you. I want to congratulate our audience members who also used the opportunity on the right side, not only to send in questions or promote questions, but some people are also finding the reply button and starting one-on-one conversations with each other. So that's very well. If you're not aware, you're not getting notified about that. So every now and then, scroll through the messages and see if someone is replying to your question or comment, and start the networking here in this online debating session. Thank you for now, Anne-Sophie, and we'll be hearing back from you when we talk with our Blue Room members. I want to quickly transition to Marco Mensink, who is also joining us online, who is the director of CEFIC, where we just also heard Steven van den Broek from, the European Chemical Industry Council. Let me start with good morning, Marco. Welcome.
Goedemorgen. Good morning.
Goedemorgen, yes. So, Marco, we are dealing with this triangle. We're talking about consumers, industry, and politics. And Anne-Sophie just said it's all about politics, while Ko Verdaas here in the studio said we need to have the consumers. But maybe the easiest thing, if just industry would pick up the responsibility and fix this all for us, right? But let's explore that perspective. First of all, I'd like to know, we've learned in this report and analysis, and also in this online debate today, that the growing volume and the variety of products require this better grip on the dispersion of the substances in our environment. From your perspective, who can be held responsible for this?
Good question. And by the way, good morning first. I'm a Dutchman speaking English with a Dutch accent, but I've been in Brussels for 15 years. So thanks for letting me join as a Brussels Dutchman on this one. I think if you read the report, and we've read it with interest, it's not only who's responsible, but what's going on. I would like to take one step back. And that comes to some of the speeches this morning, and also what Anne-Sophie just said, that we're in quite a complex situation. We're having imports of products and articles, and I think we're moving towards the focus on articles, where we fully agree. We're having internet sales with chemicals coming in. We're having a global trade, and Europe is still a world leader, but the production in China and the US is growing massively. You have consumers buying on the web outside of normal shopping channels, and you have the European industry who are inside reach, contributing a lot of data to the system. So I wish, and I sometimes wish that in more policy files, it would be as simple as industry waving the magic wand and saying we solve the solution or we solve the problem. That's what you suggested as well. The answer is in the transparency, and Sophie put forward. The answer is in cooperation in the value chain, but the answer is very much also in enforcement of governments. This week still, we're discussing illegal imports of HFCs, cooling gases, which are factually illegal, coming in via internet sales without little enforcement by governments. So there's a number of these examples, but in summary, industry to play the role with information, with filling reach with good information, with cooperation in the value chain, with transparency, governments playing a role in enforcement, but users in the middle as well, applying the chemicals where they should be applied and sharing the information down the value chain. So it's the whole system, I think you will have to activate and get used to. And part of that also in a focus, reacting a bit to what Anne-Sophie said, on the recycling system, because then you add another set of players to the situation. We believe, by the way, chemical recycling is one possible future solution. We can debate a bit on that. First answer is every part of the system, as the report shows.
Exactly. Well, thank you for sharing that and filling in the triangle even further, pointing out also the fact that we're not with Europe on just an island, right? We are dealing with competition from all over the world. You mentioned the word transparency and also the fact that people should apply the chemicals in a safe and legal way. You could perhaps say, well, industry is just filling demands. Doesn't it start with the consumers who need to better understand that they should steer away from hazardous or from products using hazardous chemicals? So I'm wondering, is making the composition of products more transparent helpful? For example, with the recommendation of a materials passport?
I always think as a consumer, or at least I try with my family as well. And you see that certain apps, which we have here in Brussels, do add information steering consumer choices. You also see that ECHA, sitting on the largest set of data in the world on chemicals, could use AI or blockchain technologies to start bringing more information to the table. At the end of the day, actually, when I sit in front of a water bottle here, very seldom I read the label, to be honest. I mostly drink the water. So I think, again, there's a role. There will be very active consumers. It's also absolutely in industry's interest that the chemicals we make are used properly and in the right way, but also in the interest, as Anne-Sophie said, of the textile producers and others for their reputations, that they use the right chemicals and use the right raw materials in their value chain. So will consumers solve it all? I don't think so. There's a role to play for everyone, which maybe I'm not the right consumer, but there's a saying about Dutch people, that we're always a citizen, except when we go to the supermarket, then we become a consumer and buy the cheapest. That's still a bit in our national culture.
Okay, so the solution cannot just be there, and I understand and read what you're saying. So how about if we move a little bit further up on the chain? How would it help if there's more? One of the recommendations is about strengthening the knowledge and capacity. Well, and the recommendation is mainly focused also on regulatory authorities, but I can imagine this is also working on the industry side. How would it help if we have a list of safe chemicals? Would that help if that's more common knowledge?
Again, reacting as a consumer, I'm sometimes getting confused by the amount of lists. And that's one comment on the report as well, where thank you for bringing it to European level, because the one thing that keeps us going in the world is that we have a European market and European rules and not 27 national rules. Where we're now about to lose the UK and get the UK reach, things start getting complex already. How can I put it? The positive list also signals everything not on the positive list would be a negative, which is not the case. We have the SIN list, which doesn't always follow the ECHA list. We have government lists who don't mirror the European list. And sometimes, and you'll hear that from companies, I think the information is always there, or a lot of information is there, but the amount of lists starts confusing people. Now, there is examples of positive lists with, for example, food contact materials. We have the positive experience there. Does it help to add more lists? I'm not sure. Does it help to keep getting more information on the table and make that chewable or in eatable chunks, as we say in Dutch? I think it does.
Exactly. Clear, very clear. Well, last question to you before I broaden it to our panel in the blue room, and that is in your opinion and from your perspective, what is the first thing that needs to change in the European policy to continue our way to a non-toxic environment, since we have the head of the cabinet of Commissioner Timmermans with us in a few minutes?
I've told Diederik that before as well. We need coherence, and I think everyone agrees. There's 40 pieces of legislation. There's 100 proposals coming up. If you look at the Green Deal with farm to fork, with biodiversity, the chemical strategy, with the decarbonization, the digitalization agenda, we've asked the Commission to look into what we call a sectoral Green Deal for chemicals. Can we have a dialogue with all together on the table? And the reason to say that, and it comes to what Stephen, for example, said, about the use of the word hazardous, which you might have recognized we don't like in this case. Hydrogen economy we want, but hydrogen is a hazardous chemical. So there's substances we need to focus on. There's more than one category in hazardous, and we need to have a more holistic debate. Same on the waste side. We had a discussion on what's called the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability this week in ECHA. Very clear recognition as well. You cannot get to a circular economy without some form of chemical recycling. And that's, again, the same more holistic view on the system. Not that chemical recycling should risk mechanical recycling or should actually prevent prevention from taking place, but we'll need the tool in place to get clean material loops as such. Now, chemical recycling might have a higher climate impact, as a discussion on what's the residues left, as a discussion on what energy used, does it really clean? Those debates we'll need to have across the compartments, as your report also shows.
All right, thank you for this, Marco Mensink.
Can I ask
Go.
Sorry,
go.
Sure. Mr. Mensink, because you make me curious. I understand you say when we keep using the words like hazardous, and we also need hazardous substances for a sustainable economy in a way. Do you also plea for a new language, a new story on this topic, because we are stuck in the old framework?
I should tell Jan-Jaap de Graaf, I'm a Wageningse bosbouwer. I'm a forester from Wageningen when environment was still called acid rain a long time ago. I'm still confused even to get all the terms in REACH right. It's highly complex. It's its own world of chemical policymakers who use their own kind of language. I wouldn't add more language, to be honest, for people like me and probably like you. But I think what you'll see is that when reports come out saying 70% of all chemicals in Europe is hazardous, some of those hazards are in your kitchen cabinet. Some of the disinfectants we needed for COVID were actually quite useful because they have an hazardous quality. We just need to manage the risk of using them and use them properly. So the point we're making is when you want to go to positive list of the other list or additional list, focus on the ones where the first and maybe major action is needed. I wouldn't add more words because it would probably confuse everyone even more.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Marco Mensink. You've just been commented on and added to by Dirk van Wel, your Dutch counterpart of the Royal Association of the Dutch Chemical Industry, who says many chemicals considered very hazardous will meet all these challenges of a non-toxic environment. He says, very Dutch, we need intelligent chemicals policy to make this in account. And we as Dutch in the intelligent lockdown understand what he refers to. Now let's quickly broaden the discussion to our blue room. We have 3 active listeners with us who've also been part of these expert panels, mainly who came to create this report. First of all, I'd like to introduce Sjoerd Dijkstra. You are the sustainability marketer at DSM Raisins, Coating Raisins. You've been very vocal also in the process of creating this report, and what I love is you tried to get your own house reconstructed in a toxic-free way. How did that go, Sjoerd?
Well, thank you very much, and also thank you, Marco and Anne-Sophie, for a great elaboration on the topic. Let me speak as a consumer first, because you're referring to the house I've been building. That was a very, very big challenge. I wanted, because of my profession working in the resins group of DSM, I wanted to actually work just with only clean and healthy materials. And I consider myself in the topic quite a bit of having a bit of expert knowledge. But even for me, it was almost impossible to know exactly what was in the materials I was using. And to some point, I went back to all the way to the chain to actually have manufacturers of products re-evaluating their formulation in order to remove certain substances, which I didn't want to have in my house. However, there is one critical element I still keep in the back of my mind, which resonates very much with actually the transparency topic, which just was mentioned before, is that I only can base that information based on what we typically call SDS data sheets, which actually have a very high burden of mentioning actually at all the presence of substances of concern. So in that respect, and then when you come to mixtures, and in my view, a mixture is often a mixture of chemicals in a finished product. It's not entirely clear what that composition of that finished product is about. So I think referring to what was said earlier, material databases or material passports will actually solve a great deal in increasing the burden of transparency about what is in particular chemicals. I have to say also, I've considered myself pretty much a geek, also with my profession in wanting to experience how it is to build an untoxic house. This is far not realistic for an ordinary consumer. And also referring to what Marco said, if I still read an ingredient list from a simple shampoo on my kitchen table, then I have no clue what all these chemicals still mean. So there is a combination of a chain responsibility. And from that respect, I also think product-specific legislation could very much help to drive us in a more healthy direction. And also in order to resonate there, where as a company like DSM, we're proactively phasing out toxic chemicals, it really is also important that we operate from a competitive advantage perspective. And at this moment in time, when it's not clear that toxic chemicals are at all used, it's very much also competitive disadvantage to start phasing this out. And that should be reverted to what I believe also product legislation could help there.
So Sjoerd, you are saying the fact that there's no legislation on transparency is actually holding you and your company back to be more transparent, because you say we're not rewarded for that?
Kind of, yes. There is a lot of legislation, let me put that forward, and a lot of legislation in respect to REACH and regulating actually the use of substance of concern in products. Mm-hmm. We are, as Europe, as far as I see that with a global perspective, far ahead there. But from a product perspective, we also do have great examples. If you look at the toy directive or what was previously mentioned at food contact materials, there you have examples where on a product legislation, from a product perspective, we have legislation in place. What I believe can help a great deal in order to also support frontrunners like DSM is to actually have more categories. And I'm mostly speaking with my resins background to building materials like coatings or textiles or carpets or furniture that actually would help. And we have certain mechanisms on a voluntary basis in place. I mean, if I look at how an EU eco-label works these days, that is already a very big step up in terms of how you would regulate, could regulate actually that substances do not end up in finished products. Exactly. And same that will legislation will very much help actually to prevent and to look at it not from a chemical perspective only, but also from a finished product.
From the product level, yes.
And Sophie said before, it is helpful for consumers. It is also helpful in the chain. For example, brands like IKEA of Kingfisher that are really wanting to drive this topic also from making responsible choices on their SKUs. That all could help, but in addition, it also helps when we talk about the circular economy. because ultimately what's in the product is something we want to bring back to the beginning of the value chain again.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sjoerd, for sharing that. And that's a nice segue into your neighbor who's next to you on the screen, Hein van Tuyl, who is the Managing Director of the Environmental Protection Encouragement Agency. And Hein, you work with a lot of organizations to develop and implement cradle-to-cradle solutions. If you've been listening to us this morning, what do you say is the key thing that needs to be changed in EU policy to make your clients, your companies that you work with, make it easier for them to implement these cradle-to-cradle solutions?
Well, I think we can come to the conclusion after this morning's discussions that we're very limited in our understanding of the problem or the challenge that we need to solve if we stick to the words toxicity and hazardous substances, because everything depends on context, which is why, and I'm sorry to Marco, who said, please don't introduce any additional lingo.
Here's the new language, yes.
But in Cradle to Cradle, we do accustom ourselves to think in terms of nutrients, because what we're actually trying to do in a circular economy is to mimic the working of the natural environment, which is basically a system where every material is a nutrient in continuous cycles. And so looking at materials in the technosphere as potential nutrients allows us to look first at toxicity, combine that with risk in the exposure, and then estimate first exposures in the second use period, the third use period, etc., which, as you can imagine, is very difficult to do. And that opens up a very important topic that I want to address in this conversation today, which is the transition from reactive recycling to proactive nutrient management. And that's where materials passports can play a crucial role. So product transparency is one thing, but to actively manage nutrients into circular systems, that is necessary if we are going to continue to work with potential hazardous materials in a circular economy.
Exactly. And Hein, who is to take action, or who's the first to take action to get on that journey?
That's in Dutch you would say a gewetensvraag.
Yes, a question of conscience. Yes. Yeah, well, what is your answer to that?
Thank you very much. So what we see, we work cross-sectoral. So we see radical product transparency really taking hold in, for instance, the building and construction industry, but also the let's see, I have it in front of me here.
Throw it in Dutch.
Yeah, the cosmetics industry, excuse me.
Okay, yes, of course.
So there are certain industries where you really see this radical product transparency taking hold, for instance, through initiatives like the health product declarations, etc. And there are industries where the price volatility of resources is so big that there's actually a very clear incentive to promote product transparency and nutrient management, for instance, the automotive sector. So I think in cosmetics industry, the main reason why companies start with radical transparency is due to consumer demand and concerns also related to chemicals used in, for instance, perfumes. Whereas in the automotive sector, radical product transparency and nutrient management are mainly popularized due to price volatility and economic concerns. So it really depends on industry, but I think in each of those industries, there's definitely a role for legislators to play in promoting product transparency. I want to make a note there, park that for a second and come back to it a little bit later. So product transparency, but primarily this nutrient management. So basically ask manufacturers and companies to proactively define what the safe and desired use is of the material in a circular economy. And the reason why I wanted to come back to the topic of radical product transparency, and perhaps Sjoerd of DSM can confirm that or disconfirm that, but our experience, especially working with the chemicals additives industry, is that there is a big challenge in going for radical product transparency due to intellectual property, and I think also rightfully so, that it might be very difficult for those types of industries to go for complete, full product disclosure.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Hein. And instead of taking it back to Sjoerd, I would like to take it forward to the next one in the blue room next to you, which is Ralf Jorissen, who is the Vice President Benelux, UK and Ireland, and the Managing Director of the Netherlands at Tarkett. And if you don't know who Tarkett is a world leader in innovative and sustainable flooring and sports surface materials, construction industry, and you might have heard of one of their companies called Desso, who is very famous for their circular vision and circular production capacity. Ralf, good morning. Thank you for joining us. You've also worked with your company in Luxembourg, which is already working with a materials passport. If you're listening to this conversation and the point that Hein just brought up about this radical transparency being conflicting with IP considerations, what is your experience?
Well, we actually run into that since we work with material health statements. So in our company, we are extremely transparent in what we put into our products. And also when we want to have our products certified, because we follow the cradle-to-cradle principles, then companies we work with need to be transparent with us. If they are not willing or not able to give us the details that we need to get our product certified, then it becomes difficult. So from our experience, I can confirm that is quite a difficult process quite often, that companies that supply to us do not want to give full disclosure on the ingredients they use.
Exactly. So with that, you actually say, Ralf, that Anne-Sophie Bakker talked about securing the market, and you say we as industry leaders taking this stand and taking this position, we are actually securing and creating a market. If you want to work with us, you got to be radically transparent. Is everybody willing to do this?
No, and that's also why this whole journey in becoming a cradle-to-cradle company is very complicated and time-consuming. After 10 years, it's still a journey where we make good progress, but also a journey where we have had to change about half of our suppliers.
But you're stating that here because you are doing that. You are basically you are in a buying position where you can say, well, if you're not with us, we'll move on to the next one. Is it possible to actually keep the quality of your product? Because I can imagine some producers say, well, we need certain substances, otherwise our product deteriorates, and that's why we use them. That's obviously the whole basis for the use of these substances.
In the end, yes, but with a few problems that you come across. One of them being that it can take you years to source the right alternative. More importantly, the alternatives are quite often significantly more expensive, which then translates into a significantly more expensive product. And on the market where we compete, which is in about 100 countries, we then run into a lot of competitors who work from a different playing field.
Exactly. So to wrap up, what would you need from the EU legislators? And I already noticed in our Zoom meeting, he's already listening. What is your plea? What do we need to make life easier for companies like yourself who have this vision and want to go for a toxic-free environment?
Well, I think first of all, the European Union and the governments have a role to play when it comes to public procurement. That's very much in line with what Anne-Sophie earlier stated. Even public authorities, most of the time, are going for price to a large extent. We do see a bit of change in certain countries, Luxembourg being a great example, where they are extremely strict. But countries should be a lot more strict than they are today. I can give you a nice example from practice when it comes to the European Union itself. In the Brussels headquarters, where there is quite a number of square meters of flooring, luckily a lot of that has been supplied by our company. But the fact that we pick up the product after its use, bring it back to the plant and reuse all the raw materials did not play a role in the procurement. It was all about price.
Exactly.
And that cannot be.
So that's back to securing the market and actually practice what you preach. So not only put the regulation in place, but also in your procurement have this listed. I just noticed...
And on top of that, if I may, I also believe that there should be legislation where the front runners are rewarded for the fact that they are also the front investors.
Exactly. And what type of legislation, do you have an idea in mind? Because obviously we're also dealing with a level playing field. We cannot just promote companies over others.
No, but when it comes to public procurement, the amount of reward that goes to price versus the part that goes to a circular approach,
that would help.
Should be different than what it is today.
Yeah, I noticed Marco Mensink, director of CEFIC, really wants to chip into the discussion. Marco, what did you have to say?
Yeah, just you can hear me well?
Yes.
I hope so. Just a short one, because we went to cradle, and I've met Baumgart and McDonough in the past. The curveball maybe on Diederik as well, underlining what was just said. If you come to the CEFIC office, we have cradle-to-cradle toilet paper, might surprise you, but it's a Dutch product. And we have Niaga carpet, which is again the other way around. It's a Dutch product again. I started trying to lobby my way into the DMAS office at the time, the Environment Commissioner 2 cycles ago, to also get the cradle-to-cradle toilet paper there. We failed miserably because the Commission services back office went for price. I think Ralph is perfectly right there. You'll find it here in the CEFIC office. You won't find it in the Commission buildings. So public procurement can take a role. Why do I come back to the triangle? Many sometimes say industry doesn't innovate, and our statement is always the reason companies are alive is that they do innovate. They take the opportunity. Following on Sophie saying we want European production, we would say one thing that will keep the industry in Europe is the relations with their customers like Ralph and the close links, which will open up to information sharing. And that's where public procurement can take a role, and where indeed the Commission can lead by example as well, like others are doing. I'm sure European industry will jump in the hole. We've tried to formulate what would be the future of the European chemical industry. The US has shale gas, China has a huge population, the Arabs will supply India, Europe will survive on being circular and more innovative, but then indeed the framework around it is going to be very, very important, not to be finding either price or internet sales on imports in the way. Thanks.
All right, thank you for that, Marco Mensink. And due to the time, Co, I think it's important we move on to the next step. Please stay on the line, keep listening well and jump in, because we are very honored to have with us Diederik Samsom, who's currently in the role of the head of the cabinet of the European Commissioner Timmermans, who's among others responsible for developing the EU Commission Green Deal and the climate law. Good morning, Diederik. Yes. Please unmute you. Yes, that's always the test. Good morning.
Good morning.
We hear you now. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. I hope you had the opportunity to listen to some of the contributions and conversations. We would like to hear where the recommendations of the Dutch Council for Environment and Infrastructure fits in with the plans that you are preparing for the Green Deal and the Circular Action Plan and the chemical strategy, in fact. So, do you consider these recommendations viable and effective when you look at them?
Certainly. And you're right, you've phrased it right. It's going to fit in strategies that we are formulating at the moment. As you might know, we launched the Green Deal as a comprehensive environmental action plan in December last year, which seems like an eternity ago.
Yeah,
in the
different time, BC, before Corona, yeah.
Yeah, a different world, a different context. But we now are in a new, well, as you know, COVID context, and the Commission last week launched its recovery package called Next Generation EU, a 750 billion program to recover the European economy. And luckily, I'm proud to say that the Green Deal is at the heart of that recovery package. So while people might think that in another context with another priority, an urgent health crisis, things like environmental policies go down the drain or at least are postponed until eternity, in the European context, the opposite is happening. We actually press fast forward on the Green Deal. I must say, we press fast forward as a policy, and delivering on that policy, that's going to be the real challenge, obviously, because I can admit that we receive already tens or even hundreds of letters from chemical companies or product makers in Europe or lobby groups, or asking for a delay of most of the regulation that is in place already. And I can understand that. It's difficult to comply with all regulations in a COVID context, but still it's a challenge that we need to address. So while we are in this completely new world, we carry on with the stuff that we anticipated to do, which is first of all the Circular Economy Action Plan, including, because the Circular Economy Action Plan is already there. That was a nice piece of paper before COVID. But in there's an announcement of, I should say, a breakthrough policy, which is called the Sustainable Products Policy, prescribing the products that we make in Europe in a much more coherent, consistent, and environmental friendly way, targeted at a zero pollution and fully circular economy. And the fact that we prescribe products is obviously not new. We prescribe every product in Europe. If I lift something from this table here, it's an iPhone. There's a CE logo on the back, explaining that is somehow regulated in Europe, in a European context. I can tell you that the iPhone regulation sort of consists of the fact that it shouldn't self-explode and shouldn't set itself on fire, which is not that ambitious at the moment. But obviously you can go much further than that. And we are going much further than that with different products already. But our aim is to revolutionize the design of products in Europe.
So do I understand correctly that the plea we just heard from Sjoerd Dijkstra, among others, and also Rolf Jorensen, that there should be legislation on a product level, is actually something that is in the plans currently?
Yes, yeah. And actually we already have legislation in place for that. It's called the Eco-Design Directive, which is actually an appropriate name to design it more eco-friendly. It was actually originally only designed at energy consumption. So it's only applicable to energy-consuming products, and you try to design them in such a way that they consume less energy, which is a pretty straightforward way of thinking. It's pretty difficult to apply in practice because every vacuum cleaner producer knows how to argue that his product, calculated differently, is environmentally and energy efficient. We are going a few steps beyond only energy efficiency. We want to regulate and prescribe products also in terms of their circularity, in terms of their hazardous substances content, in terms of their repairability, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's basically...
So you say that is the topic of today, of course, hazardous substances, and you say there's an actual paragraph on that in this proposed legislation as well.
Yeah, well, that's where we are starting to work on right now, which is called the products policy.
So we're very timely with this debate.
Yeah, certainly. And we will try to start with products that have priority, let's say electrical stuff, and the iPhone that I just raised from the table, but also other products, textiles, etc. We have to design, and that will be done in the coming month. We have to design a working plan. I mean, you cannot do every product at once at the same time. That's too difficult and too complex, and we should set up a working plan in order to get product by product or category by category into this new sustainable products policy. Yeah. At the same time, we are preparing a chemical strategy, working basically more towards, let's say, the production side of the stuff, the chemical industry. So Marco has a huge interest here. We aim to have that ready in September, and it should be aligned with what I just explained in the product, the sustainable product policy. It should be aligned in there that it helps and prescribes the chemical industry to get rid of the hazardous substances and replace them with environmental friendly substances at some costs, at innovation costs, obviously, at investments, etc. So we have to figure out altogether how we get there. And one of the suggestions that was already mentioned before I joined this conversation, the public procurement might be a catalyst in such development, obviously.
Exactly.
I always find it strange that we have the overarching chemical strategy in Europe, which is called REACH, but that was actually only, if you look at the acronym itself, it's only directed at registering the hazardous substances and not replacing them by better ones. So when we now have sort of a 10 years experience with REACH, we should now really move into the next phase, not only register those hazardous substances, those chemicals, and licensing those substances, but actually replacing them when we don't like them, and they need to be replaced by more environmental friendly products. That's all easy on paper. Well, it's actually already pretty difficult on paper, but it's much more difficult in practice, obviously, because you run into a million or a gazillion products and substances that all have their use. And I'm convinced that there's no chemical company that invented a hazardous substance for the purpose of
polluting the environment. No, that's not why they're there. Yeah. So no. Diederik, if I may interrupt your flow for a second, you already mentioned we're receiving hundreds of letters of worried companies, and obviously in Europe we are not on an island. We are dealing with a global market. What is your view on the competitiveness? You said we in Europe are going to position ourselves as the circular and most environmental friendly market, but we also see a question from René Vreugdenhil, and others have highlighted that. What about enforcement? Because we are importing water taps from China, which are leaching several heavy metals. How do we cope with that? How do we protect ourselves from these imported materials who end up in our circular chain? What is your view on that?
Yeah. Well, that's maybe one of the silent revolutions within the Green Deal, where Europe really presented itself as a more vigilant player on this issue. We are concerned about a level playing field. We've been for ages already. But the usual solution was always, when we were concerned about another playing field outside of Europe, we lowered our playing field in order to get a level one. And now we turn that table around and we try to find a way to raise their playing field in order to get a level playing field. The carbon border adjustment tax, or carbon border adjustment mechanism, because we don't know whether it's going to be taxed, is one of those examples. But there's another example too. 2 weeks ago, we presented a farm to fork strategy, which was directed at agriculture, obviously, but that's the same discussion. We import a huge amount of agricultural products that are made in a way that is not allowed in Europe, and we need to get rid of that. We need to level the playing field in a way that we don't adapt to them, but they adapt to us, which is difficult, because if you deal with agricultural products, you also deal with developing nations and another relationship between Europe and them, etc. But for instance, we have the clear ambition and commitment to reduce pesticides ourselves and to reduce the pesticides that are used in products that are imported. And we are going to have difficult conversations with other countries around the world, Canada, US, China, Brazil. We're going to have difficult conversations in the WTO context, but we are committed to make it work. For once, we are starting to show a sort of a more assertive, a more vigilant attitude towards our own playing field and protecting it by raising other playing fields.
And Diederik, this sounds beautiful, ambitious, and worth striving for. On the other hand, if we're really going to enforce this, aren't we looking at just, you use the word vigilant, protect? Is this now the next trade war, not between the US and China, but between Europe and the rest of the world?
That's indeed a very serious consideration and a huge dilemma. Yeah, that's true. I mean, you can take the border tax adjustment. You can calculate the carbon footprint of a slab of steel and just apply an Excel sheet to that Chinese slab of steel and raise a tax on it so that you level the playing field. Well, easily done. We all know that Trump doesn't work with Excel sheets. So you might also have to deal with political retaliation in some sort. And that's always a risk when going into trade negotiations or a trade war, as you want to say. So yes, we have difficult discussions on that. Also internally, we are the Green Deal cabinet with the Green Deal Commissioner Frans Timmermans, but we obviously have Phil Hogan, the Trade Commissioner, having his say, and he's weighing in too. But I'm convinced that the basic attitude is going to be the right one, and step by step we will get there.
Yeah, go for that. My co-chair here.
Diederik,
hey,
yeah, glad to see you again, although it's on the screen. You know, as former politician, that public awareness is well useful, helpful to set the agenda. And I was wondering, is there also maybe a way of setting up a new European narrative? And when you look at how we deal with COVID, despite the horror and the crisis we are in, it also brings new creativity, entrepreneurship. And is this also a time where the European Commission is thinking of a new narrative when you use those words like, we need to be the most sustainable market, ecological responsibility is there. Well, but my question is this not only about legislation, but also on the narrative? And do you have any thoughts about it that you want to share?
Yeah, certainly. When we presented the Green Deal, we presented it as a growth strategy. And actually, I can tell you, we received some criticism from the environmental movement for that. You shouldn't present an environmental strategy as a growth strategy. But we did, and I'm happy we did. Certainly in the COVID-19 world, I'm happy we did, because we need a growth strategy. So presenting this new environmental policy as a growth strategy is part of our narrative to create a different dimension, to create a different atmosphere around these product policies, etc. They're not only to protect the environment, they're also to give a new impetus and impulse to the European industry. We all know we are an aging continent with an aging industry in many countries. Not all, but in many countries, the industry could use a new impulse, and this might be the one, or one of the few that we can use. And when we presented our package yesterday, or last week, our recovery package, it's full of ideas on creating extra investments towards leaping forward towards a new industrial future. Hydrogen, renewable energy, but also circularity features prominently in the package, because we think the investments that can be done there are best spent if we immediately jump into a renewable and a sustainable future. Why build the old economy and then change it into a renewable one? Better do it once and do it right the first time.
Exactly. We have an interesting comment and question for you from Adrienne Sips from the RIVM, which is the Dutch abbreviation. I won't translate that for now. You mentioned that the transition to safer chemicals require innovations, Diederik. And we've learned from, for example, the nanomaterials that risk government does not keep up with innovation and legislation and governance. So how do you foresee to close this gap specifically with this ambitious Green Deal, and even if you could zoom in on this chemical strategy?
Yeah, that's a pertinent question, because it addresses one of the flaws of a government, and especially also of the European Union. And it also addresses the wrong reflex that we had in the last 10 years of cutting budgets on our own research institutes like the JRC, like the European Environmental Agency. We've cut them well in half sometimes, and that was the wrong approach. I don't blame my predecessors for that. There were other priorities at that moment and budget constraints, but we should be aware of that. If we want to keep up with the innovations that we promote ourselves, we need to be aware of the outfield there and the world outside. We need to create our own expertise much better than we did so far. I'm pretty new to the European machinery, but I'm also optimistic about what we can do. Because if you look at the JRC and the Joint Research Center, it's an incredible powerhouse. It's actually a gold mine of knowledge, and it has been maltreated in the last 10 years, also fragmented into little pieces all over Europe. But if we can get that back on track, I'm certain that we can keep up with the latest state of play in terms of innovation and industry.
Well, thank you for this very ambitious and positive spirit. I'd like to see if I can get an overview of my panelists in the blue room, who we also invited to listen carefully to you and to your comments, who'd like to make a comment, reflection, or question to you. Is it anyone who wants to take the floor? This is the time. I see you all over. I see Sjoerd Dijkstra immediately unmuting his mic. So Sjoerd from DSM Raising Materials, please come in.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also thank you, Diederik, on elaborating on the direction the EU policy is heading. Very encouraged to see product legislation and transparency being more on the forefront of our policy. And I do actually also, based on my previous comment, want to elaborate on the level playing field, which you were suggesting, because as a frontrunner as DSM, we absolutely acknowledge and support the fact of raising the bar instead of lowering the bar for supporting the level playing field. To my personal view, the level playing field cannot be used actually to sacrifice the precautionary principle. The legislation is there. What we see a lot is that we have products on the market that are containing no substance of very high concern, but because there are other opportunities or alternatives available in the market, there are various reasons why to still choose for the others, while from a cost or and/or performance, they're absolutely competitive. And one element is indeed bringing that back to transparency. And transparency is often referred, we also heard that in this discussion, back to the question around confidentiality and IP for businesses. That I must say that is a very valid concern. Also, if you put that into perspective with innovation or the, being active in a global competitive market. I do, however, have to say also that there are very legitimate ways to actually deal with that. First, if there is legislation, again, coming to that level playing field that forces everybody to share certain information, particularly around chemicals of concern, I think that is already one measure. And secondly, there are absolutely tools, also digitally, available to actually start sharing information across the chain, while you will share actually the hazard endpoint of a certain chemical and not necessarily sharing the full chemical name or the full chemical composition. So there is also, from a digital perspective, there is a world to win. And actually, quite frankly,
Sjoerd, I'm going to stop you right there, also in terms of time, because you keep repeating your argument that we heard from you. Thank you for that constructive contribution. So you say the opportunities are there and you're underlining your key statement. If I'd like to summary, we have several representatives from industry with us. I guess the one who collects most of the views is Marco Mensing, the director of CEFIC. Marco, when you listen to Diederik and the plans, do you feel that this is in the right direction of your ambition, where you say we also want to have safe and sustainable products as an industry?
I think so. I think first of all, we went public and supported the Green Deal and Europe's ambition to go climate neutral by 2050. So we aligned with the direction of the Commission. If you see the difference between COVID before and after, I think the difference is the recovery package, because Diederik and Executive Vice President Timmermans now have the funds and the opportunity to make a change, which I can tell you created a lot of excitement in the industry. We're going to have a discussion later on with Mr. Timmermans on that one as well. So industry is really looking at the opportunities right now. The one point maybe to raise is on the competitiveness globally, because we're in this together. We are an export sector with 46 billion exports, especially the Netherlands is such an open economy as well. And we're trying to find the tools to get us better positioned on the global market, but we haven't found them yet. And I think that's where we can do more work. And the carbon border measures there are, we actually don't know if they will work or not. We can't find the proper answer yet. The second point is still on the enforcement. Look at Rotterdam. Let's make it Dutch. How much is entering Rotterdam in the form of articles, but also chemicals and even illegal substances? Besides the knowledge, we'll need to equip the customs much more than before, also with the chemical knowledge, and make sure things don't enter Europe that don't comply with European rules. So if I look especially at the small and medium-sized companies in Europe, they can innovate, they will. They still see that their markets are taken away by imports from elsewhere. And that's, I would say, the combination of the investment in new technologies, in chemical recycling, in electric cracking, if we can get that on the road. The combination with product policy, the third leg is the enforcement policy, which we're also discussing with the Commission. So we're quite well aligned.
Well, let's ask Diederik for a quick response on that. First perspective, Diederik, where we're not only a level playing field by raising the bar for the others, but we're also an exporter. And we also learned from Ralph Joris already that if we have to replace certain substances, the substitute is often more expensive. So our prices are probably going to be non-competitive in the international market. What is your view on that?
Yeah, I know the argument. If you introduce a carbon border adjustment tax for the incoming stuff, you need to have a carbon border adjustment subsidy for the outgoing stuff. And that's
is that part of the plans?
Well, no, it isn't. And that's also, I think that is, well, a two-way system is even more complicated than a one-way system, and also because it's about public money. What we hope and what we see happening is obviously this will be the eternal tango between industry and legislators and public society to find the right balance between going forward and breaking your neck. So we think that if we can help innovation, we can subsidize and help the investments done. And obviously what we hope will happen is that those products, which might at the beginning be a bit more expensive, in the end prove to be better quality and maybe even cheaper. We have seen that with renewable energy, actually. Europe has seen that with offshore wind, and China has done a much better job actually with solar. They subsidized it to hell in the first 10 years, and now that industry is big and selling its products all over the world, and solar energy is becoming too cheap to meter within 10 years' time. That is for energy, but for chemicals, it shouldn't be different. It doesn't have to be different. You can do the same stuff. I know it's easy talking for a bureaucrat out of the Berlaymont building, and there's industries out there that do the tough job. But we are here to help as much as we can, and we are aware of the, let's say, as I said, the eternal tango between industry and legislators on this. And I am happy that actually that tango is performing quite well at the moment, because they had a huge ambition, and we were, it was responded with press releases that supported that, as Marco said. And I take note of his enforcement point. It's a difficult issue, also in terms of Europeanizing that. It's always member states themselves that want to organize and control it, which doesn't help that much. So we need to find a way through, and we haven't cracked that nut yet.
But here's the puzzle. If I can come in a final one, and I'm dancing with Diederik at about 500 meters distance between us right now.
Well, quickly, Marco, and then I go to Hein.
Absolutely. Solar was started here. Solar went to China. For our future, hugely important we get more renewables on the market. The chemicals for solar panels, and you see my Dutch finger, sorry for that. The chemicals for solar panels were made and are made by Wacker Chemie in Germany. Yeah. They are now supplying China. They're now losing the market to the Chinese companies who are undercutting them on cost. So I think the time is to sit around the table and look at these strategic value chains, the same we do now with COVID and disinfectants and our active pharmaceutical ingredients, saying, what do we want to keep in Europe? And actually having a company who's cutting edge technology in solar panel chemistry, if you don't keep them in, you're never going to get the solar panel produced here either. So I think that's the dance and the dialogue, which we will continue. And then indeed, hopefully get the industry in a winning mode in Europe.
All right, thank you very much, Marco Mensink. I'm going to give the floor to Senja Trier and Hein van Tuyl. Hein, why don't you take it away first and keep it brief, because we need to end in time for lunch, guys.
Thank you. I think the crucial word here is economy. And as Ralph already expressed earlier, sometimes it is more expensive for a company to purchase materials that are safe, which is why their circular use becomes so important, because products are not sold once, but maybe 4 or 5 times. So the imperative for the government, I would say, is to make sure that this circular potential and the potential circular use of materials is expressly defined by companies putting those materials into our economies.
Exactly.
So that's a crucial part.
You're underlining the point not only to look at single substances, not looking at accumulation of multiple substances, but actually looking at the full cradle and the full circle.
It's not just it's not just product transparency. It's also how are those products used in a circular fashion.
Exactly. Perfect.
And procurement could be a great tool to scale that up.
Yeah. Senja Trier, project manager, coordinator at the EU Environment Agency, which we've just learned from Diederik has been cut dramatically on budget. So please come in.
Yeah. Well, I think a very good point is that we really have an opportunity here with the European Green Deal. And what we need now is a very strong policy framework to go forward so that we can get the innovation, not just in sustainable technology that will put us in a good place with our exports, deliver on climate change and deliver on circular economy, but we also need that innovation to be in safe products and safe materials and safe chemicals. And I think, yes, well, maybe now we are not there, but this is exactly what we need to strive towards and innovate towards that. As the example of the cobalt-4 needed for solar panels, this is a hazardous substance. It might be essential now, but we need to have innovation that strives towards finding solutions, alternatives, so it becomes non-essential. And I think this is really it's a big challenge, but I think Europe is really in a good position. And if to deliver on this, both the sustainable and the safe transition. And I think with that, we can then eventually achieve the goals in the European Green Deal, where we want to achieve a sustainable environment, not just for ourselves, but also for the future generations. Exactly. And that's my comment.
Thank you for underlining that as well. And with that, and looking at the clock and looking at the chairman of the Dutch Council for Environment and Infrastructure getting ready for his closing remarks, I want to make a final round to Diederik Samsom, head of the cabinet of EU Commissioner Timmermans. Diederik, thank you very much for joining us. I hope that these contributions have been useful for you in moving forward with your plans towards the Green Deal and the chemical strategy.
They certainly are. And we have a lot of work to do. I do realize that. And after this, I do realize that even more. I want to get one pretty important point, because also Marco and others refer to, and I did myself, refer to the recovery package that we produced last week. That is a proposal. The money is not there yet. And we need 27 member states to agree on this. And actually, we need 27 parliaments to ratify the whole thing afterwards. And we need that to be done before the summer. So this is quite an ambitious package. And if there is a voice from the Raad voor de Leefomgeving, but also from industry and also from other actors that can contribute to a swift adoption of this package, it will certainly help. We in the Commission do realize that we're not there yet. There's a huge difference between countries, east, west, north, south, and we are going to see quite some difficult European summits in the next month, maybe more than 2, in order to get to such a result. I know sometimes industry has a forceful voice in many countries in Europe. Use that voice, because otherwise we're stuck with a COVID crisis without an answer. And that would be the worst situation we can get into.
Beautiful. Thank you for those closing remarks, Diederik Samsom. And with that, I definitely want to point you also at all the questions, comments, and additions that our audience have been submitting throughout the broadcast. We will download them and submit them to your email as well, so you can use them in making your plans. We didn't have 27 member states, but we definitely had 10 very valuable panel members, which I definitely want to applaud and thank virtually. If you want to do that on Twitter or LinkedIn, use #Rli-online or #Hazardous substances. We had from the scientific world, Werner Brack sharing how we can monitor the accumulation of substances. Xenia Trier from the EU Environment Agency in Denmark. Thank you very much, Xenia. Christina Ruden, Professor of Ecotoxicology in the University of Stockholm in Sweden. Thank you for being with us this morning. Steven van den Broek from CEFIC in Belgium. Thank you for joining. And also André van der Zande, the committee member together with Co Verdaas here in the studio on this Council's report. Thank you for joining us, listening in critically and contributing. And also our second Blue Room kicked off by Anne-Sophie Becker, Executive Director of Chemtech. Thank you for your powerful words and your 2 additional recommendations to the report this morning. Marco Mensink, Director of CEFIC, representing the chemical industry in Europe. Sjoerd Dijkstra, very passionate from DSM Coating Resins. Thank you for being with us this morning as well. Hein van Tel from the EPEA, Managing Director. Thank you for enlightening us with your views on the cradle-to-cradle challenges. And also Ralf Jorissen, the VP Benelux and the Managing Director of the Netherlands for Target. Thank you all for contributing, for listening in, and hopefully you use these insights, these thoughts, these reflections to broaden the impact of this online debate, to broaden the impact of this research report here this morning, so we can all thrive towards a more safe and environmentally sound Europe, and specifically related to hazardous substances. With that, we come to the chair of the Council of Environment and Infrastructure, Jan-Jaap de Graaf. You've been listening since the start at 10:30. You've been taking notes, and we invited you to give us a powerful shout-out to end this online debate session. Jan-Jaap, please take it away.
Thank you, Sybren, for giving me the floor. I've been impressed by the density of comments and recommendations that have been made this morning. I will try to summarize, wrap up in 2 ways. First of all, I will take out some points, 5 in total, that have become quite clear this morning. So I will do a lot of injustice to people who have made a lot of other points, but I will take up 5 points that have been quite clear, have been made clear this morning. And then I would like to finish with a closing remark. The 5 points I have noted, Sybren and others, are first of all that the analysis and the recommendations that we have made in our report from the RLI have mainly been sustained, and not even that, also some new points of attention and recommendation have been added. But there were also some question marks, and I have noted specifically our recommendation on the use of safe lists, because on one hand, question marks have been put behind the use of another word, the word safe, but also the use of extra lists have come into question this morning. This is my first point. Second point is several obstacles have been identified. I think 2 of them are very important. First of all, when tackling this problem, we are dealing with an enormous amount of hazardous substances. And secondly, there is still insufficient knowledge both on the substances themselves, but especially on the effects of accumulation. The third point is when it comes to solutions,
And also to our recommendations, many speakers have underlined the importance of transparency and of the use of track and trace systems. And my fourth point is that we have identified in our report the different roles of industry, government, and the public. But some of the people this morning, and I think I can agree with that, have said that do not overestimate the possibility of the public to act as a party that is equal to industry and government. Several people have said it is mainly a task that should be entrusted to industry and government, and of course public plays a very important role, but do not overestimate that role. That's the fourth point. And the fifth point is that I have noted, and we have all noted, that Diederik has said that a lot of attention is given to this problem on the European level, especially in the Green Deal, and it's very good to hear that the Green Deal is at the center of the recovery plans that are being made now to recover from the COVID problem. And also Diederik has stressed the importance of transparency, but also said the role of legislation on the European level that is very important and will be elaborated further. And I think that the strategy that is being followed on the European level is to aim both at growth and green quality is the right direction. Those are the 5 points that I think in wrapping up emerge when I have listened to the conversation. And I would like to end also looking at the clock with a final remark. I think we all agree that we are dealing with a very important question. And I think we also all agree that there's a sense of direction in which way to move. But the way to get there is very complex. And sometimes you get the feeling that we are on a worthy, but sometimes quite hopeless mission. And that makes me think of earlier days in the late 70s when I was dealing with the problem of the pollution of the Rhine. I was active on the International Rhine Commission. And there, at that time, we had the same feeling. We were continuously talking in the Rhine Commission on treaties that were not observed and promises that were not kept. And we were continuously fighting with the Swiss and the Germans and the France on the main policy questions at that time. And being young at that time, I had the feeling that we were never going to get there, that it was all completely hopeless. But at the same time, the Rhine became better. The Rhine quality improved, and that went very fast. So I have been asking myself later, how is it possible that we are talking amongst each other on a level of, in this example, the International Rhine Commission, but the same could be said on Europe, where you get a feeling that we have more problems than solutions, while on the other hand, environmental quality is actually getting better. And I think that is because at that time, and the same thing goes now, we should not underestimate the importance of publicity, of awareness and attention as a factor in itself. Once people get aware of a problem and they get convinced, and that goes for people in government, it goes for people in industry, it goes for people in the public in general, then we start moving in the right direction. And that is what in the end solves the problem. So I would like to finish with, of course, there's a very important triangle consisting of industry, the public and government. But there is another triangle, which is also very important, which consists of awareness, attention and publicity. And I think that what we are doing, what we have been doing within the RLI, what all the parties concerned this morning have been doing, and what Europe is doing is being active in that triangle also. And I think when we keep talking about the problem, when we keep thinking of solutions, when we take care that publicity is being given to what we're doing, that will in the end perhaps help more than regulation or treaties or whatever. So with this hopeful note, I would like to finish my closing remarks.
Thank you very much. What a powerful message. This was Jan-Jaap de Graaf, Chairman of the Council for Environment and Infrastructure. And the good news is, Jan-Jaap and all the others still watching, we have a hashtag for that. If you want to play the triangle of awareness and public perception, please use hashtag hazardous substances so everyone knows what we're talking about. If you want to refer to this specific event, use the hashtag Rli-online. I'm looking very much forward to your key messages, your photos, your takeaways on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, everywhere where we can search for hashtags. Now, with that, we hit the end of our lunch break. Ko Verdaas, you're still with me as my co-host, here in your role as a member of the Council and chairman of the committee who produced this extensive report. Closing reflection, how do you stand here? How do you feel?
A little bit relieved, but also full of ambition that we need to take this further. And thank you for a great job.
Thank you, Ko. And if those viewers who are interested in more materials to use in their advocacy, please go to the website www.rli.nl, or if you're still on this broadcasting page, look on the links on the right side of your screen at the bottom. You find links to the report, you find links to the extended video that discusses the report, you find links to the infographic, all the material that you would like, both in Dutch and in English, to bring this message forward. And with that with all that ambition, with all that excitement, and perhaps a little bit of a rumbling tummy, we have to go out into the world. We thank you, and this is the moment for all our experts, for all the companies, for all the governments, for all the NGOs that have been watching, to go out and take action now.